what was?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, thank you. If you don't want to record it, it's completely cool. So I just have about 10, 15 questions. I know that it's about I put it as an hour meeting, but hopefully I don't think it's gonna be that long. Although after this, I actually want to see if we can talk a little bit about politics since I already have you here. You're such a
Okay.
good speaker. So, just to start off light, kind of wanted to introduce the UBI since a lot of people don't necessarily are not necessarily as invested in politics, but it's not necessarily a politics thing. I kind of want to talk about that. So, just a quick question: do you see the policy of UBI tied to any political party?
No, I think of UBI as you can think of it as cross-partisan or bipartisan or non-partisan. Um, but as I coined back in, I think it was 2014, basic income was not left or right, it's forward. This is something that Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek supported, and this is also something that Martin Luther King supported. There's no reason to think of this as any kind of uh, partisan thing. This is it's getting money to people in a way that does not involve the typical conditions, and that is not a partisan kind of thinking.
Okay, so it's not really much of a Democratic or Republican thing. I know that the Yang Gang has this kind of a slogan that's it's not a left policy, it's not a right policy, it's a forward policy, kind of a popular idea.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so for my second question, so Miami has both in urban and suburban cities with Miami Gardens, and then you have Brickell, and then you have Sweetwater. Um, how does the UBI affect each geographical setting?
Well, a universal basic income doesn't treat geographies any differently, and that's one of its great strengths because as we know, let's say even throughout history, there's been a lot of say racist kind of policies that treat say more African American neighborhoods or more minority neighborhoods differently than say mostly like white neighborhoods. Um, that's a problem of inequitability in our systems. And it's funny, just like how often this happens. Even when you create policies that have a law that says you're not supposed to treat people differently, it'll still happen. There's ways around that, and you have to enforce these things for them to even matter. To really treat people equally, you have to actually treat people equally, and that's a universal basic income. If everyone receives the same amount, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their incomes, regardless of where they live, then that is actually a truly equal floor. And there's some interesting kind of potential there too, as far as let's say look at a poor neighborhood and a rich neighborhood. Um, if you're a poor neighborhood and suddenly everyone in that neighborhood receives $1,000 per month, then you could effectively say double or triple the amount of income in that neighborhood. Like it could be just a huge increase that really makes a difference in their lives. And then if you look at a rich neighborhood with the same number of people there, and and then they get $1,000 per month in basic income, that could just barely budge their total income. They could boost them by like say 5% or something, and so it could be virtually nothing to them. So it really does it does a lot more for those in greater need. It disproportionately impacts the traditionally marginalized lower incomes than it does those at the top.
Yes, and I agree with Miami. Miami actually has a 19% poverty rate. So if you give 1,000 to those who need it, it's definitely going to make a bigger difference than those who necessarily use it as an advantage. My next question is I don't for this is a fan question. I kind of asked some people from different political spectrums. I don't want government assistance. Would the UBI be optional?
Yeah, it's of course optional. The same thing goes when you do your taxes. Like you
Yeah.
don't have to accept like various tax credits in these things. You're free to turn them down. And even if we decided that you could not say no to this and you absolutely had to receive it, then there's nothing stopping you from giving it away. There's nothing stopping you from donating it. The way that the Alaska dividend works, I think, is a good example. So for those who don't know, the annual dividend has existed in Alaska since 1982. It's the closest example in the world to a functioning universal basic income system because everyone in Alaska receives the exact same amount every year, regardless of their incomes, regardless of even their ages. Kids actually receive the same as adults there. And when you look at Alaska as this example, first of all, people apply for the dividend. It's not like an onerous process, but you do actually say, all right, I want the dividend, and you get it. But then when you apply for it, even then you can say it's called Click Pick Give is their program. And so there's like a selection of places where you can actually send your money to. And so it gives them options as far as like you want to donate it here, you want to donate it here, you want to donate it there. And people can just easily say, all right, I accept this dividend, but I want my dividend to go here. And so they make it really easy. And I think that makes sense too, as far as if we're going to do this at a national level, then allow people to get it and determine if it should go somewhere else, to save them that trouble instead of even letting them decide after the fact and then figuring out just give them some options. And I think that's helpful.
I completely agree, especially with that. If it's the name, the freedom dividend, I think it's better. It gives people the freedom, the liberty to choose what they believe is better for them. Um, for my next question, I wanted to ask regarding inequality. We've talked about how the UBI is going to affect everybody, but recently there was a recent 1,200 stimulus check that was not applicable for dependents, and a lot of students under the age of 25 or whichever, they didn't receive a 1,200 stimulus check.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any exceptions? I know we talked about there being any exceptions to UBI, but when it comes to taxing, when it comes to representing those who were previously not represented, how can we use the UBI to represent them accurately?
Yeah, so I think there's a difference between universal basic income and the stimulus payments. Of course, just even based on the fact that the stimulus payments was means tested, and it did decide to ignore dependents and this kind of thing. But there's also some like justification and reasoning there. So if we make a point of doing an unconditional basic income, then you're actually saying, look, as a citizen of the United States, or as a legal resident who has been here over 5 years or something, if just you as a person, then this money is yours. The stimulus was not recognizing any kind of civic right or anything like that. It was more like a charity kind of thing, like saying, oh well, let's just get money here, and then when you do it that way, there's less strength in being able to get it to everybody. So I think part of the unconditionality helps the universality by actually recognizing a kind of right of citizenship to this. And when you do that, it makes it so much easier to actually reach people. Like, so let's say, look at the the unbanked. So these are people that when it came to the stimulus payment, they weren't able to get like the direct deposit. Which was the direct deposits were the first ones to go out. That was the easiest for people. If you're not the banked, then how do you get them banked? And so there's barriers there that we need to get around. And if you have a fully universal benefit and people, it's seen as a right that people have, then it's so much easier to actually even say, mobilize organizations to actually help those people get that money, because you're basically connecting people in need to something that has already be determined as theirs. And when there's that kind of setup, it's so much easier to make that happen versus like getting money that people have been given as charity, to people who don't have access to that, and then like why help them, and it's much more difficult to do that. So in that regard, I think that it's important and it works better to have those lack of conditions to actually reach those people. And again, that's even like we're talking about the unbanked, but it's a good example with the dependents. Like it's it's really weird how they did that. Essentially their logic was saying, if you're a dependent of someone, then you're obviously like not your own person, kind of, and so it's up to them to get the money, and we shouldn't give them more money because it's like their choice. They have a dependent, and so that's what like helped lead to these situations where like they're saying, oh well, you're already getting like a tax benefit by claiming someone as a dependent, so you don't need this extra money. But when you have like a universal basic income, you're saying, look, every single person gets this. It doesn't matter whatever they're doing or who claims them for anything whatsoever. It's just if a person exists, get the money to them.
Yeah, I really agree with that. That's a really good. I really like that. And Mr. Santens, you've been working on this for over 7 years. Is UBI possible within the next 4 or 5 years?
I mean, it's been possible, and it's always been a matter of will. Like it's building that political will, and we've seen a lot of that increase. Like thanks in large part to Andrew Yang and his candidacy, it certainly became more likely. And now, because of this pandemic and the shutdown, the stay-at-home orders, um, uh, the millions of people going through the safety net systems for like the first time ever. Like there are tens of millions of people who have never before claimed unemployment insurance are now experiencing what that process is like. And tens of millions of people, who have never experienced the need for a food bank, who've never sought one out, are now in lines thousands of people long for food banks. And here we are, we introduced a stimulus payment, and say half the people haven't even gotten it yet. You have these unemployment insurance systems that were not designed for this many people, and it's state by state. So some states do a better job of it than others. Actually, Florida itself is one of the worst examples, where in March, 3% of the people who had actually successfully filed for unemployment received a payment in March. And so a 97% failure rate is effectively for unemployment insurance is just unacceptable. And I think as people get fed up with this, and I think as people experience just how messed up it is, this bureaucracy, the conditions, the fact that these things that are supposed to work just don't, will make people more willing to say, look, we really should just do this universal basic income idea. Let's just actually make sure that people get money, and that it's a monthly, that it's a secure thing. And then we can, figure out what else needs to be done. But at least if we do that, then that actually works and it gets done, and we can go from there. And I also think that in this particular instance too, there's some estimates that say 42% of the jobs eliminated are not coming back. That if an employer fired 10 people, that they'll hire back, say, 3. We're looking at a situation where there's an actual like long-term unemployment situation. And when you do that, and we're looking at that, and this is combined with the fact that automation was already accelerating, and that a pandemic means that companies are investing even more than they already would because robots don't get sick, and that it's also a great opportunity to increase your productivity and make up for the fact that you had to fire all these workers. It's combined with automation, with the unemployment that's happening. It just makes even more sense than it usually would. And then there's also the fact that as we experience what could very well be the next Great Depression, as far as a deflationary spiral grows, um, how do we get out of that? The way to get out of that is to stimulate our way out of that. Like, people actually have to have more money than they had, last year, in order to spend more into the economy to get us out of this. Like, we need to create this virtuous cycle where people have more money to spend, so they're spending more money, and then companies and businesses see that spending, they're able to invest in hiring more people, and so more people get jobs, and then they have more income on top of what they're receiving. And so you could create this virtuous cycle through increased demand and increased spending. That's what we need, and that's basic income. And so hopefully with all those things combined, then people will be more likely to see that this is the way to go. And I also think that there's kind of a race going on too around the world, and there will be a country that does do it, at least temporarily. There will be a country that, say, has basic income for 6 months or a year or something. And what will the effects of that be? I think that they'll be extremely positive. I think that they're going to stimulate their way out of their recession faster. And the other countries are going to be like, well, wait a second, like, that's really working for them. Maybe we should do that too. So I think that this could potentially grow around the world quickly as soon as the first country actually does move in that direction, even temporarily.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to bring you back on the automation.
Sure.
And the reason why I wanted to bring you back is because locally in 2018, it was reported that the most common jobs in Miami-Dade County, which is currently where I'm reporting, 25.2% are retail and commercial jobs that Andrew Yang has stated that can be lost due to the great displacement. So with over 300,000 jobs that are being able to be up for grabs for automation, how serious should Miami take UBI as a solution to fight off the great displacement?
Yeah. So even the great displacement and the effects of automation, it was already certainly a problem. And as Yang has said too about this epidemic, that we're basically seeing 10 years worth of automation happening in 10 months, or I'm sorry, 10 weeks. We know that it's already unfairly distributed as far as the effects of this goes. One of the figures was that 40% of those earning under $40,000 were unemployed. And if you look at those earning, in the like seven figures, like, they're barely touched. So this is really disproportionately hurting those who were already earning lower incomes. I saw another figure that was looking at that gender differences, and it was that 13% of women have lost their jobs, or sorry, 17% of women have lost their jobs versus 13%. And then you looked at single mothers, and it was 23% of single mothers had. And if you look at single mothers who were working as servers, and you're looking at 83% have lost their jobs. So, like, this is particularly hurting the people that have the least ability to actually, get out of this problem. And they're the most impacted, the worst hurt by this. And again, like we were saying earlier, to have this flat universal floor absolutely disproportionately benefits them the most. And if we're going to actually set up a society to where automation actually works for all of us, then you have to have this floor, and it has to rise as productivity increases, I believe. I think that it makes sense to tie it to, say, something like GDP per capita or some measurement of productivity, so that as you automate more, then the dividend increases, that you get more back. And when you do that, then for these people, let's say if you're in a low paying job, let's say you're in a minimum wage job right now, and then the basic income starts. So it's I think people confuse it and think that it's like you either have a job and you're earning income, or you don't have a job, and then what are you going to do? You just have a basic income. But most people, it's just a temporary situation. Like you are unemployed, you fall to the floor where the UBI is set, and then that enables you to figure out, okay, what's next? Maybe it's figuring out retraining, maybe it's going back to school, maybe it's looking for the next job. And that can take a while. Like it can take, say, 6 months or a year or something to find the next job. But at least that's there the entire time for you, operating as a floor. And then when you get that next when you get that next job, now you have the job income plus your basic income, so you're even better off than you were before. And also it gives that bargaining power as well. And I think that bargaining power is something that tends to be overlooked. So right now, let's say when you're looking at minimum wages exist because people are willing to say yes to jobs that pay so low of wages that they'll actually live in poverty working those jobs, because they can't say no. It's better to have $7 an hour than it is to have $0 an hour. So you'll agree to $7 an hour. So then the government steps in and says, look, we can't have people accepting $7 an hour. So let's set it at, say, $10 an hour. So that way no one is allowed to accept for less than $10 an hour, and no employer is allowed to pay less than $10 an hour. Well, if you actually give people the power to refuse that, so you say, look, if you're already earning $1,000 a month and someone offers you a job for $7 an hour, maybe you'll look at that job and you'll say, no, I'm not going to accept that. I'll work for $20 an hour, and then now you got a negotiation set up. And that's what's missing from the existing labor market, is this complete lack of negotiation, because people are just accepting anything that they can. So this actually makes the labor market work better. It actually enables us to look at these minimum wage laws and decide, does that make sense? Because another thing too is let's say someone could work for, let's say they would say yes to $5 an hour if they already had $1,000 a month basic income. And maybe they say yes to that because it's actually a really valuable, meaningful job that people really want. So why shouldn't they be able to do that? If you have a minimum wage in that situation, then let's say you're only able to hire one person to do that really valuable job, where if you could pay less, you could have two people, and those people would really want to do that. And so it's I say it's the power to say no, and also the freedom to say yes. And when you have that power to say no, it's more bargaining power. When it's freedom to say yes, it means you can do stuff. You can afford to do work that you couldn't otherwise afford to do. You can volunteer. You can do unpaid work. And I think that's really important in this future we're going to, where people where there's more machines doing more of our work for us. And let's actually liberate people and enable them to choose what it is they want to be doing. And until we have basic income, you just can't really accomplish that.
Actually, that's a really good point. I was actually one of those people who overlooked how that could change the labor market, and I actually have to write that one. That's a really good point. Wow. Yeah, and it makes sense, because I was actually just finishing reading Andrew Yang's book, and he was talking about how people are graduating more on degrees that they felt was more necessary, rather than chasing their life goals. And
yeah.
with a UBI, you can definitely focus more on your personal life goals, because you have more of a safety net.
Yeah, and another part of this too is a say redistribution of time. And so I think there's a lot of concern that says, okay, look, if we lose half of our jobs to machines, and we have twice as many people unemployed or whatever, then that's a problem. But they're assuming too that the work week doesn't change. So if you have half as many jobs effectively, or half as much paid work to do, then why are we still defining a full-time week as 40 hours? If we redefined a full-time as 20 hours, then that way everybody could actually be just as employed. Like everyone could still have a job. They'd just be working 20 hours instead of 40, and all those jobs would exist on top of the basic income that they're earning. So, part of this too is looking at, look, as we get more and more productive, let's actually like have more and more time. And there's an economic argument there too, because you can't consume stuff that you have no time to consume it in. If we you can't just create more and more and more stuff into the economy and expect everyone to buy it, because the thing that we all have that's limited is still time. And so if you give people more time, then in addition to this secure floor, then they actually have more time to actually enjoy that and pay for those things, than they would be otherwise able to do. So yeah, I think that let's say if you're looking at complementary policies, then I think it really makes a lot of sense to have a basic income combined with a shorter working week, because then you're not worrying as much about people being unemployed and not able to do anything whatsoever. You're making sure that essentially you're slicing up the jobs more so that people can share that available labor better. And that makes far more sense than kind of this belief that, oh, if there's not enough like jobs, then let's create and invent those jobs through like a job guarantee kind of situation.
Yeah, right. And Mr. Sanson, I have a quick question. I know we talked about the demographics with Miami and how suburbs and cities compare, but you're also working with a candidate from Kentucky. How
Mhm.
would a UBI work in a rural areas where the dollar value is higher?
Yeah, I think that's one of the great benefits of a fully universal basic income, that it does go further in rural areas. So there's like a few things that come out of that I think are really important. First of all, we've been looking at the opposite for decades now, where rural US has been drying up, and the only jobs have been like centered more and more in cities, in urban areas. And we used to have like a very rich kind of Main Street USA kind of culture in the US, where each town had like this kind of thriving kind of center downtown area where you had all your local businesses and that people would go to and spend money at. And now that's been disappearing. It's been disappearing because people have had less disposable income to spend. That the cost of things that they have to spend on, like school, healthcare, these things cost more and more as there's less money to spend. And there've been like an evacuation as people exit these rural areas to go where the jobs are. A UBI would reverse that. You would actually be able to live in these rural areas again. And I think you would see a renaissance as far as small town USA, because people could actually start up local businesses again. They'd have more capital to do that, but also they would have the customers. And that's the really big thing about universal basic income, is that it creates a customer base. So in these rural areas where there's effectively a giant lack of customers, then suddenly they would have tons of customers. And so you could start up that restaurant, you could start up that local bookstore or whatever. Even if Amazon exists, there's still reasons to actually go to your local business, because right now, if your choice is go to your local business and pay more money for it, or go to like Amazon or that kind of setup, and you barely have any money, you're gonna go Amazon. You're gonna try to save as much money as possible. But if you have more disposable income to spend and you're in a more comfortable position, then you can start making those choices that actually help your local economy more. And you can do that specifically. You can say, look, I am choosing to actually go to my local store because I actually want to help them. I know that my spending is good for the local economy. So that's a big deal. And also there's the ability to move there too, again, because of this decoupling of people to where the jobs are, which is in cities. And so I think that you would see kind of a geographic kind of remixing where you'd see depopulation in highly populated areas, and you'd see a repopulation throughout the U.S. in these more rural areas. And again, because your dollar goes further, and because you no longer have to live in cities, you actually have that freedom to live in other places. And if you have the decision to say, spend 100% of your basic income on rent, or the decision to spend 20% of your basic income on rent, or even buying a house like in an affordable rural area, that's something that a lot more people are going to do. So I think that we're going to see through a basic income a real just kind of like a, and I don't want to say like go back to like the 50s kind of situation, but really, like if you think about when like America worked for everybody, and that people could like experience the the American dream, anywhere, then I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and people really could actually live in these smaller town areas, and you wouldn't have as many people fleeing from those areas because there actually would be opportunities there that don't exist right now.
I actually agree. One of the reasons why I moved to Miami was because of opportunity. So as a person who had to leave a rural
Yeah.
areas for there, completely agree. But this is gonna be kind of a not exactly a big question. It's kind of a local concern. So Miami-Dade County has a really big amount of Cuban and Venezuelans. I myself am a Venezuelan as well. And because of the historical past and the current events of Cuba and Venezuela, a lot of people aren't really fond of socialism. What would you say to people who associate the UBI with any form of socialism or any sort of non-wanting anything that regards with policy and politics and a political party?
Yeah. So one of the things I like to point out a few things normally. This is a very common question and concern. First of all, I like to point out that again, the closest example of UBI anywhere in the world has existed right here in the U.S. in Alaska since 1982, and Alaska is actually a Republican state. It's a red state. It's not that kind of red. It's Republican red, and it has been that way, for a long time. It's actually considered to be like one of the more libertarian states in the U.S. And it's accurate too that it's a dividend. This is it's a very capitalistic kind of thing for an investor to receive a dividend as their return on investment. And in Alaska, the people of Alaska are seen as essentially the shareholders of like the natural oil wealth of Alaska. The percentage of that oil wealth goes into a giant permanent fund that's been growing over the years. It's over $60 billion in size now. That fund is invested in the markets, and the return from that fund is actually shared equally through all of Alaskans. So at no point would we look at shareholder dividends as being socialistic. And I don't think that it's fair to look at basic income in that same way. It's a dividend. It's a return on investment to the taxpayers who are actually making all this possible. And I also like to point out too that Monopoly is a game that I don't think people say that it's a game about socialism. Like Monopoly is a game about capitalism, and you get money to start the game, and every time you go around Go, you get another $200, and that money makes the game possible. The game isn't teaching anyone socialism; it's teaching that markets need money to function. Money is the fuel of markets, and basic income is just making sure that fuel exists for people. I also like to point out too that Milton Friedman was for this idea, and it's pretty silly for anyone who knows Milton Friedman to like somehow like call him like a free market socialist, or what does that even mean? He and Friedrich Hayek were both for UBI, and they were both considered to be like the leading pioneers of essentially the free markets as we think of today. It's just UBI is just money that really makes this entire system work. And I'd also say too, just beyond this, that there's the potential for basic income to actually improve capitalism by making markets work better. And so, just a way of understanding what I mean there is that imagine you have a store. Let's say it's an ice cream store, and you're just not seeing enough customers, and so you go out of business. Like you can't pay your bills. You didn't have enough people buying your ice cream, so you're done. Now the question is, did you close because your ice cream sucked? So basically, there you had a lot of customers around you, but they weren't able, that they chose not to buy your ice cream. Or is it because the people actually really liked your ice cream, but they couldn't afford it? They didn't have the money. It's not that the ice cream was too expensive. It was that they were too broke. Did not have disposable income to actually afford your ice cream. So that's where there's an issue with the demand supply signaling, is that the market is dumb as far as knowing the difference between null and zero. And if the only way to make sure that it can tell the difference, to send cleaner market signals, is to make sure that in economy, every single person in an economy actually has enough to be a consumer. If everyone has money, now you know your ice cream sucks if you failed because people actually had the money to buy it. And I think that once you do that, because just think of like how many businesses have failed in the U.S. due to not because it was a bad product or a bad service, it was something that people actually wanted, but people just didn't have enough money to do it. So if you make sure that people have enough money, then actually you're going to have businesses that are doing stuff that we want them to do. That these are quality products and services that we are actually choosing to support because we can, instead of these businesses failing when we really didn't want them to.
Yeah, and to go back to the locality, My bad. I apologize. With the 25% retail and commercial jobs. My bad. Brain fart there. Let's say that we don't accept UBI. What could be the worst case scenario projected if we do not accept UBI?
Well, I think we're starting to see the tip of the iceberg of the worst case scenario right now with like the rioting that has just started happening. We can say that this recent rioting, the fires, the looting happened because of an incident of racial injustice, as far as yet another cop killing another black man, but also these conditions are ripe for these kind of things to actually set sparks, and for that to result in conflagration, because of the conditions on the ground being rampant poverty, inequality, chronic stress. People just stress the hell out as far as how they're going to get by, and they're seeing other people getting by just fine. They're seeing actually yet another giant transfer of wealth to the rich through propping up like asset prices, through bailing out corporations and the banks. And when you see all of that happen, and then all it takes is like a small event or an event of any size to be that event that sparks something much, much bigger. So I would not be surprised if we see even more rioting as events continue. And that's like the in-your-face kind of effects of not eliminating rampant economic insecurity, because also economic insecurity is tied to racial, injustice and inequality as well. You really do need economic justice and more equality to actually really affect these racial differences and problems. So that's where it's right in your face we're seeing right now. But I think we're also going to see things that are less in our face, but are still really bad. And so the less in your face This is deaths of despair. We saw many deaths of despair as a result of the Great Recession last time. You saw people directly committing suicide as a result of this. You saw people, say, drinking themselves to death. So this is, let's say you start drinking a lot more and then your liver fails. So then you die from that. That's considered a death of despair. Um, let's say you're barely getting by every month. You turn to opioids, and then you end up overdosing accidentally. That's a death of despair. We're going to see a lot more of those happen. Potentially more deaths of despair. Actually, I would say for sure we're going to see more deaths of despair than we've already seen of 100,000 deaths from COVID-19 as a result of this if we don't actually introduce basic income to eliminate this economic insecurity. And there's also the non-death stuff too. So this is increased like spousal abuse, partner violence. This is child abuse, um, and it's even just more crime. Um, the the costs of poverty are extremely expensive, both in human terms and financial terms, and we're going to see those costs rise as well. So it makes increasingly less sense to not do this when things are going to get worse and worse. The costs are going to go up, and you're looking at potential social breakdown and possible mass violence if we don't get our act together in time.
Yeah, actually, I just saw a recent research saying that the birth rate has been historically low, and a lot of people are saying it's because they don't want to kind of bring their kids into this world type of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, my last question, it's kind of just it's not necessarily UBI. I'm writing about the opinion, so I'm going to select some quotes, but I was hoping if it was okay with you to upload the full interview, just in case to YouTube, or just in case anybody, if they want to watch the whole interview, because I plan on writing about the benefits of UBI, but I don't want to just selectively pick and choose. I want the whole thing, the whole rod.
Sure. Yeah.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you. And hold on.